Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Hauser Wirth. I'm Russell Salmon, Director of Public Programs here at the Gallery. We're thrilled to have you all here this evening for a conversation between artist William Kentridge and Professor of the Humanities in the English Department and Comparative Literature Department at Harvard University, Homi K. Bhabha, to celebrate this incredible new exhibition, William Kentridge, A Natural History of the Studio. Yes. This is William Kentridge's first exhibition with Hauser Wirth in New York, and it presents his acclaimed episodic film series, Self-Portrait as a Coffee Pot, with more than 70 works on paper integral to its creation, which is what you see on this ground floor, as well as an array of sculptures featured on the second floor. This immersive exhibition is the first ever to present nearly all the drawings from Kentridge's filmic masterpiece, hailed by critics as a moving, witty, and ultimately wondrous synthesis of the personal and the political, the individual and the universal. The exhibition also extends to the gallery's 18th Street location with a concise survey of Kentridge's printmaking practice and is accompanied by the eponymous, newly released publication from Hauser Wirth Publishers, created in close collaboration with William, which translates Self-Portrait as a Coffee Pot into book form and follows special previews of the series at the Toronto International Film Festival and BFI London Film Festival. The complete series of films was first seen in an installation curated by Caroline Christov-Bakargiev at the Arsenale Institute for Politics of Representation in Venice at the time of the 2024 Venice Biennale. The entire series is also streaming online via the Mubi platform at mubi.com. If you haven't had a chance to page through the book yet, it is truly stunning, and signed copies are exclusively available this evening for purchase at the front desk, so please grab one before you leave today. Thank you all again for being here. We're certainly in for a treat. With that, please join me in welcoming artist William Kentridge and Professor Homi K. Bhabha.
Hello, yes, this is working.
Yep.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Russell, and thank the gallery for hosting us more than once, and it's always a pleasure to be with you, William. Now, I was going to ask you start with a question about what should my role be here when you speak so wonderfully to yourself in the film. There is nobody who speaks to you or with you or against you or for you as well as you do. So I want you to keep that on hold. I want to come back to it.
Hold is good.
Hold is there.
Yes.
But what I do want to say today, William, is how moving it is to be here today with your practice. Range of media, chalk, paint, film, draw, erase, move, begin again, think again, pause, black out, start again. This is about the freedom of movement and the freedom of expression. And it is extraordinarily moving to me at a time when there is very little movement except for those deeply vulnerable who are expelled, and very little form of rethinking, re-beginning, what Hannah Arendt called the great power of natality, to think again, to be born again. And I was so moved. I mean, I know this work, but seeing it today, seeing the film upstairs, it seemed to me to be a fable of the freedom of movement and the freedom of expression. And this country needs it more than ever. We always need you, William. But today, seriously. Now about talking to yourself.
Okay. Good. So, to give a kind of a shape to the studio and thinking and walking and moving and in the studio. Obviously, there are large questions in the world, questions of history, how we understand history, questions of responsibility, of guilt, all the things that are not just South African questions, but which start for me very much as from Johannesburg outwards, and it links very often to similar questions in different contexts around the world. And those questions are there, but I suppose what the series tries to show is that in a way, as you enter the studio, it's not that they disappear, but they change form. And the studio has to be a safe space for stupidity, for not knowing not even what the questions are. You have to trust that the questions are in you, and those larger things, but that when you're in there, the walk, as you say, the walk around the studio, the periods of waiting, not waiting for inspiration, waiting for an energy to grow, to actually put the mark down on the sheet of paper, and also one relies a lot then in that process for the work to tell you more than you know. I think someone said of a poet, one of the poets wrote, saying the poem should always know more than the poet. If the poet knows everything the poem is going to do, then why write it? The hope is that there's surprises and links that emerge, whether they're emerging from different unconscious parts of your brain, whether it's a tumulplatz of free association of a psychoanalytic kind of space. But at any rate, the big questions often disappear in the process of making. And they disappear in the process of, should it be charcoal? How dark should the mark be? How light? Oh, you've drawn the shoulder in the wrong place, go back and redo it. How could you think that's the way to draw a peony? The big questions dissolve into these myriad of quite banal, immediate questions, in the hope that nonetheless, when they emerge from the studio, it's not just a series of tentative formal solutions.
Well, that's actually, I'd put it the other way. Sorry, hello. I mean, I'd put it the other way. I think that through the detail, through the erasure, through the redrawing, the larger questions emerge. You know, looking today around this, around the work and thinking about the work, you know, there's this great line from Walter Benjamin who says, the magisterial moment of time doesn't come into the artwork. What the artwork has is a detail of gestalt. That's what your close identification, psychic and gastronomic, with the coffee pot is about. You know, you have this. In the detail comes the allegory. So in a way,
I'm interested in saying through the way that the allegory emerges. So a lot of the things that emerge, well, take the coffee pot for example. It comes because it meets the activity of drawing halfway. It arrives as almost a half-made drawing, like the telephones that appear in many of the films. There's something about the black Bakelite, old-fashioned rotary phone that's halfway to being a charcoal drawing in itself.
Oh, so the material is there in the object.
The material is there. You know, there's these coffee pots that have quite the straight, ruled lines of the edges. The facets catch light in different ways, so you have a tonal gradation already given to you by the object. And so the risk or the trust is that, okay, I'm just going to draw a coffee pot and it will explain it to me maybe later why it ever needs to be there. I mean, I suppose it's very much trying to answer the question that my father would pose me, which was, I once told him I was doing theatre production of Albenberg, of George Buchner's play Wozzeck. And I'm doing it with a puppet. I was doing it with a puppet company in Johannesburg, Handspring Puppet Company. And what he asked me saying, he said, I'm not saying that it's impossible to do a puppet Wozzeck. I'm just wondering why it's necessary.
Why is it necessary to talk about the coffee pot as the self-portrait of the artist? I get what you've said, that the coffee pot in itself catches light, it has shape, it has form, it looks a little bit like a Cossack.
Right.
Yeah.
But no, so the coffee pot as a self-portrait as a coffee pot is answer to a different question, which is to say, you can do a self-portrait in which, like there's one over there, where you draw it and you try to get the proportion of your eyes right and the shape of your nose and your chin to arrive at what is commonly termed a likeness. You see the picture and you recognize who it is. But in the same way that you could say you could write your biography and, in that sense, make a self-portrait, through all the books that are around you in your house, all the books you've chosen to read, all the things that have gone through your head, and a negative portrait of all the books you've never bought or not wanted to read. In the same way, you could say if you spent 50 years in the studio, then in a way, all the different things that you've drawn over the years are part of a way of arriving at a self-portrait, and the same way a negative self-portrait of all the things you've never chosen or never been able or wanted to, or had the need to draw. So the coffee pot stands in for that.
Right. And the beauty of it is, I think, and the magic of it is, that these are objects in the studio. These are objects in the kitchen. These are objects that you actually use, material objects, crayon and paint. And yet, they add up to something which is so significant for the new way in which it makes you think about domesticity, or in which you think about cooking, or indeed in which you think about art. And here is what I think is one of the great signs of a fascinating, beautiful piece of work. It makes you wait before it tells you what it is. It makes you wait. And usually the response when you look at, what do you think of this? Or the critic has to immediately set down, and all that is necessary. But great poetry, great art, actually makes you wait. And it doesn't make you wait to say, I will give you a good ending, like the 19th century novel or historical painting does. Just wait with me and you will see it. Here, I see in your various dialogues in this film, it's just wait with me, and I will see who I am and how I am different from myself. So the coffee pot is a form of otherness, is a form of alterity. And I think those relations with trees, with shoes, with feet, are the magic of this work, and also its profound meaning.
So in my head, I'm going back to what you're saying about waiting, the wait.
Yeah.
I mean, the time in the studio shifts, and I mean, obviously with animation, one's aware that one's constantly changing conventional time, in that a gesture which takes 1 second to make in the world, that's 1 second. In conventional terms, that would be 25 frames that would pass through a projector, or 25 fields in a video that would pass through in that 1 second. And so already you've turned time into a kind of number. And then maybe to draw those, you'd take 15 minutes to do each of those 25 different frames. So your 1 second is already shifted to 2.5 hours. And then when you play it back, when it's projected, you could do it at full speed, you could do it at half the speed, you could do it backwards. So there's a way in which that sense time already becomes unstable. It turns into something completely intangible, becomes something completely material. In the sense it's the charcoal on the paper, it's the different frames, it's what's held in the... so it's possible to... But the weight is different. There are different kinds of waiting, and I'm interested to know how you see the waiting also. So, for example, there's any one of these drawings, like the waterfall over there. If you're, as a viewer, looking at the waterfall, and it's a drawing, you may say, I'm going to give it I'll look at it for 15 seconds or 20 seconds or half a minute. However, but it's your time that you're putting into it, your 15, 20 seconds. As soon as there's, for example, a stupid bird, just an animated dot flying along across the top for 5 seconds, isn't in that one, there wasn't a trace. Suddenly the time shifts into the picture. And you're simply observing the time that's held in the image rather than your own time. So that's one kind of shift of time. And then there's the gaps when things don't make sense, and you hope at some point you'll leap over a gap that is left, a riddle that doesn't have an answer rather than a riddle that has a clear answer.
You said in an interview in the Financial Times not so long ago that the thing you had to search for in yourself was a gap. And when you don't find that gap, it's very difficult to know what next to do. And I want to just propose that gaps have been extraordinarily important, as I see it, to the making of the work, to the representation, and to the historical moment. If you think about The Head and the Load and The Great Yes and the Great No, you always use a passage of time, a gap in time. This is not a historical time, but the way in which you reconstitute that time as choreography, as painting, as drawing, as music, that time is being completely reconstituted in a whole range of different objects, and I would say languages. I think that even if you're scribbling, you're making illegible dots. I think the formation of language is very important to the way in which the chalk hits the paper, or even the way you edit the film. So I think that you're always looking for these passages of time. Very often they're interstitial. They're either at the beginning or the end. I mean, the great yes and the great no. They're in the ship between Marseille and Martinique. So this in-between time which does not have the normal time attached to it. Durational time is not time here. What is time is what I would like to call diurnal time. One thing after another, one day after another, one bird after another, one coffee pot, and indeed in your studio, you demonstrate it all the time. One step after another step. And in the work itself, you're always changing the rhyme of the step and the languages of sometimes it's dancing, sometimes it's walking, sometimes it's sliding. So it seems to me waiting is a way of putting all those different moments in these passages of time together.
So it's interesting because, I mean, all of the processes you're describing feel very familiar. I'd never thought of them myself as slicing time. I thought one of the obvious processes of the studio is that of collage, from the beginning of the 20th century, it was as an obvious technique, not hiding the collage, which has always been there in the artist's work, but showing here are different fragments clearly stuck together to make the work. And so it's one of the things which is an obvious technique in the studio and a natural thing one's used to, but which also shows a way that we can understand the world outside of the studio, which is normally invisible. Because when you read a history or you think of history, you don't think the whole time, what I'm reading is a provisional construction of many fragments of information which have been chosen or rejected to give a possible history. So in a way, and with editing, obviously with editing film, if you're not just editing it sequentially, you're dealing with ruptures, constant ruptures, in the belief that even if they are very disconnected different moments, when you watch it, your brain is constantly finding connections and jumping over gaps. So it's both rupturing, but then hoping that we're going to suture those ruptures as we go.
Yeah, but of course the interesting thing about that form of suturing, which is like montage or collage, is that the wound is always peeping out. Like in any suture, you know this is not the kind of continuous flow of a landscape painting or a narrative. You haven't even jumped over but you see the gap. You see, I have got to take the gap, make some sense of it, and then move on. Right. So this seems to appear again and again, both in the way in which you use the materials you use, but also in the way in which time is in the work. For instance, you often have these panels. There are decisive gaps between the panels. When you project the work, the objects disappear and reappear. This is what I mean about the possibility of continuity, but not a form of continuity that is imposed on you, a narrative imposed, but a narrative constructed.
I mean, that's a very clear example, and it's an example of between what it is in the studio and kind of as it leaves it. Because I think what you're saying feels completely right, that for the film More Sweetly Play the Dance, which is 8 screens and there's a procession that continues, but it doesn't flow automatically from one screen immediately to the next. There's a gap. There's definitely a gap and a rupture. Sometimes it's slightly out of sync, it's out of order, there's figures reappear twice. So it does have all the things you're talking about. But from the logic inside the studio, we had a distance of approximately this wall to film the people walking along, the figures in it. And we would film them, and that corresponded more or less to one screen. And we would film that, and then we'd film it again, because you knew it was going to go across 8 screens. And so people would advance and go slower, or different people would come in. And then we sewed it together. And for the first 3 weeks, the editor worked mightily with all the skills that were possible to get this footstep to be in sync. As someone left the one screen, so they would go on to the other. And we realized at that point that all the work we were doing was simply trying to hide how the film had been made and what it was. And then we said, okay, in fact, let's look at it if there is this gap, if there is this disjunction. And we find, okay, when it was there was something, as you say, that gives a different sense and an important sense. But it arose as a product of the way of making, rather. It started the opposite direction. It said, how do we show disjunction in the world? It wasn't that. That arose when the work was done.
But that's always our conversations. Yes. I say something and you say, yes, that's true, but that's not the way it happened. And that's why it's so exciting.
No, but I think that is the case, that there are things that emerge in the making, that come out of the material, whether it's charcoal.
Absolutely.
You know, the fact that you can't hide an erasure in charcoal, it's always a ghost of it, and that's becomes part of the meaning. And in many cases over the years in the studio, it's been those things either that I've thought about or that I've started off thinking of as faults, which has taken people outside the studio to say, stop complaining. In fact, what you see as wrong is the one part we're interested in. And then I go, okay, let's recalibrate. Yes, the smudges are interesting. Let's keep the smudges.
And quite apart from the smudges, then the music has its own diffusive way of both shaping the smudges or shaping the transitions and taking it yet again somewhere else. But now I want to tell you, I think time must be short, isn't it, Russell? We must have to, you tell us when, you want us to cut out. But what I want to say is that I want to take this whole technique of montage for a moment into a larger frame of historical representation. You know, much of your work looks at moments of emergency or crisis, one way or another. You infuse them with a certain kind of Dada and Gaga, make America Gaga again, would be a suggestion I would have for a future work. But I think there is something about the way in which you see history, its juxtapositions, its aporia. It's neither this and it's neither that, and what do I do? This is not the worst time as in Yes and the Great Yes and the No, the opening scene. Is this the worst time in the world? This is not the worst time, but this is time enough. This is bad enough. So I wanted you to just talk about montage as a kind of viewing of historical events and times, but of course answering the question by looking at the technical issues.
I was recently rereading or looking at the Metamorphoses of Ovid as a, as one knows, one of the things that animation can do, it can shift something from one form into another, backwards and forwards. And I realized in the Ovid, the metamorphosis, the transformation from a woman into a tree or a man into a bird, they're always a response to a crisis, to a panic. So you have a king who's got his curved sword and he's chasing his wife down the corridors of the palace because she's just fed him their children to eat. And so there's crisis and panic all around. And it's in that moment, as he's about to strike her, that she's able to transform into a bird and become a swallow and go up into the eaves. And the man with the sword transforms into a hoopoe, a wood hoopoe, and goes into the woods and becomes a wood hoopoe. And it's like the pressure builds and builds until there is this kind of transformative rupture. So working with charcoal and animation, that always feels, how does something earn its transformation? I mean, a lot of the great, and I'm a huge fan of a lot of animation like Tex Avery, and that's always about transformation without consequence. A safe falls on your head and you become a two-dimensional flat figure, but then you're back up again. And it's you're pierced by 1,000 knives thrown at you from the kitchen, and you're like a pincushion, but then you're back again. So that sense of it's also, I think, that he had such a spectacular imagination of transformative possibilities, and mine is quite a plodding sense of transformation, so that I also feel it has to earn its transformation.
So what happens in the transformation to past, present, and future? Are these irrelevant time markers?
No, I think that it's. I think what you'd actually pointed out when we spoke before about the great yes and the great no, where there are big questions. The opening line of the piece is, now the house of justice has collapsed. There has been wrong done, I ask for right. And that feels a completely contemporary moment, but it's in fact Aeschylus writing at the beginning of his play, The Furies. I take a brick to show how beautiful my house once was. This is Bertolt Brecht writing in the 1930s. Misfortune flows as from a water main, another Soviet writer from the time. So what you said was that it's not a question of them being universal, saying, oh, these are the universal conditions, it's a circle, but that they're iterative, I thought was the term you used, that they come back, that things that happen, one reuses those same lines because they seem to echo with where we are now. And then that play, which was about migration from France, Vichy France, under the Vichy government to Martinique in 1941, was both a historic moment of that particular escape that people had to do, but obviously also then has associations with all other movements across the Atlantic, whether it's during the slave period, the Middle Passage, or whether it's about so many contemporary migrations which are by sea, with the costs of those. So it's that there are, I suppose there's there's enough and more than enough associations that press those phrases or those histories to be used. So to do a play or the theatre piece about Martinique, it's an interesting historical place. It was a tiny island, but that was seen so valuable to France that they swapped all of Canada to keep just this tiny island because it made so much money from sugar. So it has a historical influence, but I was really interested that it was the home, this tiny place, it's probably the size of Rhode Island or smaller than that, with the great poets. So first Aimé Césaire, with, for me, one of the great poems of the last century, Notebooks of a Return to Native Land, and his school pupil, Frantz Fanon, came from Martinique. And even that, their great works were written 60, 70 years ago, they're still so much part of people's thinking. Certainly in South Africa, in Johannesburg, the writings of Fanon and the writings of Césaire in a more lyrical way are very present. So it jumps across. It's both historical, but it's also, and it's not trying to be an allegory of the moment, it's saying just these are things which stand out as being interesting moments.
And you just, in that sequence, you bring in Suzanne Césaire, because what she's talking about very much is the transformative nature of nature itself, of the environment. But yeah, I think when we were in Arles and we spoke, I think that's the issue. I would just want to clarify it, that I believe your work, I believe universals are not the first principles like we often think they are. Universals, life, death, freedom, hunger, equality, inequity, these universal values are universal because they come back again and again as questions to us. Yes. They're not principles, they're questions, and we have to restructure them and reform them and work through them again. And in that sense, your great allegory of historical clash, the two birds, that come together and then they blow up. But for you, they don't blow up and just leave the world in smithereens. Because of your transformative Ovidian art, something else emerges, and another narrative can be talked about. But the beautiful thing is that the past, the traumatic past, is not just spoken of as it is, as it was. The traumatic art then leaves a very contemporary trace. So your work is always about now, and then comes then. It's about the afterlife of these traumatic moments, which reshape both the present and the past in an ongoing transformation, to say there will be another universal shout out or another universal.
I mean, with Suzanne Césaire, who became a central character in the production, The Great Yes, The Great No, again to talk about, she was largely written out of the history of negritude, even though she was one of the founders of it. And so while we were making the play, her voice started coming in, and she was a character on the boat. And I wanted the French voice to come. So we found an actress from Belgium, who's from Rwanda initially, but she lives in Belgium, and had been trained in French acting school. So had a very beautiful, both African and French voice. And it was because, I suppose, of the strength of her presence as she came onto the stage in the workshops, that the role she had suddenly expanded, and the character of Suzanne grew and grew in it. So again, it's like not starting with an idea, saying we need to find a way of making Suzanne center stage, but saying what is the strange alchemy that was the character that somehow grew because of the material, in this case, the actor that we were working.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm trying to say, is I think the real strength of the work, that the performance precedes the principle or the idea. So in that context, I want to ask you how you think that this notion of transformation works in and through the historical materials. That's one of the things that most impresses me, is the things you choose to work in and work through. To put that together with waiting, I want to ask you, what was it like to work while waiting in South Africa during a system which, your father was a great active legal figure in that world, and then he left, and you continued to work there. And you continued in a way to work continually against the grain, but you stood there and worked. Reminds me of a line by Toni Morrison, which I think is very much part of your resilience, where in a lyric of hers where she says, "This is not my home was prettier. This is cold, this is terrible. But why does my key fit the lock?" And there's something about that in your work. And as we wait in this country, anxiously, I want to know how you worked waiting anxiously.
I suppose the medium short answer initially
Give the little long one.
the little, slightly longer one. When I finished being a student and I was starting to work in the arts, I had, I suppose, what one would describe almost as a Leninist view of art. What is to be done? What are the images that the world needs? What are the posters that need to be? What does the shop steward need to be taught? And so there were posters done for trade unions and theatre projects done. And at a certain point, I realized there was this gap between trying to think on behalf of other people, which had, however hard one tried to avoid it, a kind of patronizing element to it. I know more than this person, so they need to be taught this image that I can make. And that came to a kind of crisis head where I stopped. I sold my press. I decided I wouldn't be an artist. I thought I'd become an actor. That was
You did it
disaster.
for about, what, 7, 10
about
years?
3. I'd worked for some years, maybe 4 years, and worked in theatre groups and so on, and then tried to become an actor, and that failed. And then tried to work in the film industry, and that was a disaster. And then came back to, in spite of myself, found I was making drawings again, but making drawings then in a very clear sense of not having to plan or know what the meaning would be in advance. To take images or thoughts, and so the first drawings were copies of photographs by Brassai, without saying to her, what does this mean? What does it mean to be copying someone else's photograph in a drawing? To say, let it be done, and we'll see what emerges. And that's kind of the principle that has continued. But it became also clear that at one point I was part of different arts political organizations, where we had to decide what should be boycotted, what shouldn't be boycotted. There was the ANC, the government had a cultural desk which asked for advice. And I discovered I was really bad at it, not necessarily because all my ideas were wrong, but because I couldn't bear going to all the meetings. We'd make a decision, and then I'd hear, oh, there's another meeting being called where they said, in the light of new information, we should revisit the decisions we'd made at the last...
You want a job at Harvard?
and I realized that all my time in every meeting was saying, let it be finished now, let it be finished now, let's just make the decision, let's just vote, let's not argue, let's just vote and have it done. And so I understood then that insofar as I had anything to do, it would be in the studio and not in the other world, and work in a very different way and have a kind of commitment to the métier, to the actual, what one owes to the métier rather than what one wants the métier to do for you. And so that meant it was kind of quietly working in the studio during the states of emergency, it was different to going out on the streets and marching when we did in 1990 when the organizations were unbanned. But it was essentially quiet work in the studio. We had many friends who were much more heroic, who were part of the underground movements and ended up in detention or assassinated. But in South Africa, it was also, within the visual arts, it was quite hard to get any work censored. Within literature, certainly within film and news, there was very strict censorship, but I think the arts were seen as so small. So, I mean, there was one painting in South Africa that was banned, and this was a painting a man did of a Last Supper, but he painted Christ wearing a Christmas hat, and that was deemed to be blasphemous. There would be things would be censored either because they had communist propaganda or because they were sexual. And so all the films that I made, the animated films, had to go to the Publications Control Board to be seen in South Africa. The first one came back with a report saying, this film, this is Johannesburg's second greatest city, contains scenes of fellatio and intercourse. However, they are sufficiently badly drawn as to not give offense. So I never knew what they thought, and there was just a sympathetic person on the board who said, just let it
So
pass.
they were very aesthetically advanced. And
Yes. No, I mean, we discovered afterwards that, I'm sure that had also been discovered in Germany and other places, when it was revealed who the different members of the boards had been during the years, that there were a lot of relatively well-known poets.
But one of the things you said to me earlier when we were having lunch is that it was a deadly system, and I mean that, but it was not as capricious and despotic in its, as we see it's authoritarian.
there are a couple of things which are incomprehensible to someone not living in the United States. So one is American gun laws, which seem crazy. But the other is the ability to rule by decree that the president has. So in South Africa, yes, there were draconian laws and there were things, but you kind of knew where you stood with each law, as opposed to a new restriction or a new thing being done every day at the whim of one person or another. So people would, with greater or lesser risk, be able to navigate how they chose to either stay in South Africa or leave South Africa. And there were many people who did both.
William, in the film, a self-portrait of the artist as a kettle, there is a moment where you and a remarkable young South African woman dance.
Dada Masilo.
Yeah. And there are two things about that moment, maybe not universal things, but rather eternal things. One is the fact of aging. Her body, and with due respect, yours.
Well,
No, wait a minute. Yeah. You're a very skillful...
I'm going to defend that.
You must. Extraordinary skillful dancer. I wish I had your talent. But right through the film, the aging body returns, almost as a kind of foretelling of age. And then there is this young body, one lithe and the other profound, if I might put it that way. Let me ask you, and in that context, in this kind of round lay, there is a moment where you say truth and beauty, beauty, truth, the Keatsian thing. Tell us about that. Tell us about truth and beauty. Age and youth.
Age and beauty.
I thought this would be a good kind of universal closing moment.
Well, first about the dancing. So Dada Masilo, who is a generation and a bit younger than, or nearly 2 generations younger, we had many different improvisations, different projects that we worked on. She was one of the great dancers in South Africa. And so she would say, well, let's do this. So we do the same gesture. So she would stand and she could lift her leg, so her leg was over there. And so I would copy her, and I would simply lift my arm, and then we'd be in parallel.
Oh, that's what it was about. I now understand it.
Those sort of, in that sense, we were able to work together. In the film, I'd said to her, wouldn't she choreograph me for this moment? And she does for a short moment. Left, right, now pirouette, stop. And with great good skill, the editors cut at the moment I finish the swing round, so you don't see me falling over at the end of the pirouette. I'd kind of asked them to say, well, could they just repeat it? So I really have this virtuoso spin, but they said no. One was enough. And then we cut it over that. And it is, in terms of extremely painful ironies, that Dada, who was 39. Died a couple of months ago from a straightforward surgery and went into liver failure. So
she died?
She died. So that beautiful dancer that you see all around in the screens.
Let's hold a moment.
I think
just for a moment, and we'll continue. Thank you.
Yeah, she was a great collaborator, friend, and it's a big gap.
And the truth and beauty thing?
The truth and beauty was
in that dance.
That was I'm trying to remember the origin of how we got. There's truth is beauty, beauty truth. There was another line from Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yeah.
There's beauty in the bellow of the blast. There's beauty in the bellow of the blast that we would repeat. And there were other strange lines, but that's the one that we kept. I suppose that's the question. Is that the irony that a lot of things that don't appear beautiful seem to have a weight, and that it's. I'm always skeptical of Keats's, truth is beauty, beauty, truth, that is all you know and all you need to know. Was it the Grecian urn?
Yeah, so that's very similar then, to come back to where we started, with some of those more universal paradigms that you mentioned. You know, is this the worst time? We all need more justice. And then in the working out of these things is a whole language of allegory, a language of art, a language of music and dance, but also a language of interrogation. Think again. This may not be the worst time, but nonetheless, it is bad. And I want to thank you for lifting our spirits by showing in your work repeatedly how major issues can be constituted through small, detailed attention. How things happen in the Ovidian sense, and then they don't disappear, they turn into something else. I think we all hope that for our lives, and we hope that for this country as much as we hope that for you, and you bring to us this remarkable message and this great beauty. You don't bring us truth, but you do bring us a lot of beauty. And leave us to find out what is true.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.